Welcome to Narrow Line of Acceptance, where we discuss the limits of social media and its inclusion and acceptance of all people, regardless of their race, ethnicity, body type, sexual orientation, or gender. In each episode, we'll call attention to flaws in our favorite social media platforms and the individuals who use them. It is our goal to establish that there's no right way to exist and that we should never be policing someone else's body.
I'm Sophie.
And I'm Megan. Today we'll be talking about trans and intersex identity in the context of social media. All right, so Sophie, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you were researching? That way we can get started.
Sure, yeah. So my research for this project basically focused on YouTube and specifically this particular subset of YouTube videos created by the trans community. And so basically what I was kind of analyzing was how these YouTubers making videos, especially for trans youth, can be kind of helpful but so harmful based on the narratives that are kind of promoted. I actually the coming out video genre, and then also like the reaction video genre, which is like where someone who's trans basically reacts to like pictures or videos of their pre-trans or like their closeted self, and basically kind of just says what they feel about it. And I was sort of arguing that these coming out videos where someone says, like discloses their gender identity to the audience, that they can often fall into these kind of common themes and narratives of like the born this way narrative, which is sort of a way of like queer people saying like, oh, I always knew I was queer, since like age 5 or something, which is not always the case for every queer person. This kind of theoretical thing called hormone time, which is basically sort of focused on the emphasis of like medical transition and hormones, and the idea that like what I call kind of like the darkness of the blanket, which is that like the transition cell should be seen as like with shame or like should be something that's hidden. And I was sort of arguing that that's not necessarily how every like trans person sees themselves, and that kind of seeing these narratives over and over again can potentially affect trans youth because they feel like maybe that's the only way to be trans. And so I was kind of basically saying like after all that, after doing this kind of analysis of these videos, that the conclusion is that I think more videos about more diverse topics should be made with more different narratives, just because as I think is we know, really not a lot of education about trans identity in schools. There's not a lot of resources, I would say, and a lot of trans youth are really searching for like knowledge and mentorship and just like kind of reassurance. So it's a very important genre for providing all those things.
Cool. So I was just wondering something like, what do you see as some of like the advantages and like the drawbacks of YouTube as a platform for like the support and this education for both like trans youth and for cis people too?
Yeah. So I guess in terms of like pluses and drawbacks, I think that there's a lot of positives. I think that there's something very cool about the fact that basically, and I'm sort of, in my paper, I was sort of looking at mostly like the emphasis on trans youth and like how they can benefit from these videos. Because like we watch what we seek out, right? And so it's probably mostly trans youth who are looking for information about like coming out or like starting hormones or something like that. And so basically some of the positives that I saw were that I think that it's very, a lot of YouTubers are like very honest about their experiences because they're just trying to sort of do public service and educate people. And so I think that means that trans youth can really get some very like honest perspectives that they might not be able to find in other places. For example, I think that on trans YouTube there's a lot of information about like taking hormones and kind of the effects and stuff. And in fact, I've heard from some like my trans friends, for example, that like medical professionals are not super educated on those topics because they're not really taught in medical schools. And just because of like bias and societal transphobia. So I think that trans people kind of being empowered to like ask for what they want and kind of making the medical establishment work for them is very important. And so these videos can kind of help with that. So I think like some of the drawbacks are that there's definitely like with any YouTube subsect. I think that like pretty privilege is definitely a factor in who gets more views, because that's how it is. I think it also privileges people who have the time to make videos like every day. And like both of the YouTubers that I analyzed, mostly because they kind of had large platforms, I was interested in how like these people with a lot of influence were kind of being able to like promote these narratives. Most of them are white and they're binary trans people, and pretty wealthy. I think like Jackson Brookfield and just sponsorships. Gigi is a very famous socialite and makeup artist, YouTuber. But that's like not necessarily the fact for like all YouTubers. For example, like Kat Black, who trans woman of color, is maybe a little less well known, but she definitely talks about those two, like being trans and also being a woman of color. So I think that, and of course, like the comment section is always a source of potential conflict. But yeah, I think that there is definitely pluses and minuses to YouTube as a platform for communication.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, that all makes a lot of sense. There's definitely, some positives, some negatives for everything. So I guess another thing is, what do you think, activists and stuff, what can we learn from YouTube as a platform when thinking about how to support trans people and educate audiences?
Sure. Yeah, so I guess I think that YouTube is a very cool platform for kind of like that we can use as a model for just like other activist movements. I would say that what I think is really exciting about YouTube, and definitely a thing that like I think all movements should be thinking about, is just sharing the voices of the people who have the experiences they're talking about, like trans activists talking about trans issues. I think also like one thing that was very exciting to me and why I wanted to kind of research YouTube in the first place is that it's very accessible. Not entirely like if you don't have an internet connection or like a device to reach it on, but I think that in the grand scheme of things, it's like quite democratic in that way that if you just have like an internet connection, you can access it. And especially like for people, like for queer people who might not be out or might not be in a supportive environment, like the ability to access resources without like outing yourself or having to do something that might compromise your safety is really important. Also, the thing that I was thinking about is that I think that, in the kind of larger scheme of like LGBTQ identity and also trans identity in particular, is that I think that a lot of mainstream narratives we see in like movies and films and even sort of like maybe from like large like advocacy organizations, this idea that like, oh, it's so hard to be queer or trans, like, there's so much harassment and homophobia and transphobia, and like no one would choose to be queer because it's such a hard life. And like while the fact is like that these difficulties and these kind of challenges and like bigotry exist, I think it can be kind of harmful that to tell like queer people that just because they're queer, like they're going to be sad and terrible and there's like that's what it's going to be. And I think that's not true. And I think that a lot of like trans YouTubers that I was researching, I really noticed this kind of pattern of like that's very particular to being queer and to being trans. And I think that like that's such an important thing to show, like especially youth, is that like being part of this group does not mean that you're going to be miserable. It's actually very like cool and amazing thing. So yeah.
Oh. Yeah, so how do you think that like this specific sector of YouTube videos kind of responding to how trans bodies are policed by society, how do you think that kind of all plays out?
Yeah, so that's a really like good and interesting question. I think that definitely, so like if you're trans, like people, like society does police like the appearance of trans people and like the action of trans people. For example, like their adherence to the binary, their ability to pass as cis, which is pretty cisnormative, and it's and it hurts trans people, right? So it's kind of forcing them to use someone that they may not want to be, kind of setting up these standards that privilege cis people. And also like people of color face additional policing based on like racial stereotypes and things like that. So I think that YouTube in particular, I think that in some cases like it can kind of follow policing and kind of reinforcing beauty standards around like transition or like particular like surgeries and stuff, like basically kind of teaching people like, oh, this is what like this procedure should look like, or this is what transition should look like, which is something I critiqued in my paper. But I think also like just the fact of people talking so frankly like about their bodies and like about their lives really kind of leaves room for like this kind of expansiveness. And I think also just like, when people are able to like talk about themselves, I think that it's not like the situation of like, let's say in a TV interview or something, like fetishizing, asking a trans person like really difficult questions because they're kind of choosing to share what they're sharing. I think like in the mainstream media and like in movies and television and stuff, there's this real desire and like kind of fetishization, fascination with trans bodies, and just kind of a tendency to like reduce trans people to just like their surgeries or like their like medical procedures, and really like talk about like what it means to be a trans person and like kind of their whole narrative and their whole story to like impact an individual. And I think that like YouTube videos can really help with that by kind of like making people be like, there's so much more to talk about, and there's so many ways to like talk about trans identity that are not rooted in this weird kind of like fascination or like desire to like other trans people. So I guess I'm really interested to hear about your project, Megan. If you want to kind of give us a little bit of background about what your paper was about and your research.
Yeah, so I essentially kind of researched two different movements on social media, and one was about the recent bans on trans youth competing in sports, which was #LetKidsRun, and the other was a ban on elite intersex athletes competing in professional sports, mainly track and field, the women's 800 meter, and that was called #LetHerRun. And, by comparing the response on social media to these two movements, which, were essentially about the same kind of controversial topic of sex versus gender identity as a segregator for sports, I found that, analyzing the psychology of the people that were their potential supporters of the movement was really important to kind of figuring out whether or not the movement was going to be successful. So when you look at #LetKidsRun, you have adults and parents, and then young girls who would be competing against these trans girls, so cisgender girls that aren't being affected by these bans, who don't really have anything to lose by showing empathy to these trans kids who are supposedly going to be posing a threat to them, and that's why these bans need to be put in place, or at least that's the argument by legislators. And when you look at the competitors of the intersex athletes, so the XX women that they would be competing against, you have a completely different psychology because they're actually worried for their own professional and financial success, because they actually do feel a threat from the intersex athletes that they're competing against, because those athletes do win. And it definitely is something that's interesting because it really shows how important it is for social media to kind of cater towards women with privilege, because when you look at this movement for intersex athletes, they can do as much as they can to kind of like show that, hey, like this is something that is unfair to these people and we really need to show empathy to them, but without being able to convince the people that are kind of in this position of privilege to decide whether or not they're going to give that empathy. Without getting them on your side, you're not really going to get anything done. And it is really, it's an unfortunate fact, but it kind of definitely shows really the nature of social media, I think, in that you have to really cater towards, people who don't really have skin in the game. And it definitely is sad that people who are really fighting and giving their all for something that is 100% affecting their life, for them to have to not necessarily say, hey, this is my story, this is the help that I need, because this is what's happening to me, for them to have to think in the back of their mind, well, how can I make this palatable to someone who doesn't understand me at all? It's really sad that that's kind of what they have to do, but it definitely is something that I picked up on when I was doing my research for this. So yeah.
Yeah, oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, thanks for that sort of summary. So one question that I'm wondering is, based on your research, and how do you think, how successful is social media in informing people about and kind of providing a platform to discuss social justice issues, like just compared to traditional media?
Yeah, so I definitely think it's a case by case basis, at least from my research. So I think for hashtag Let Kids Run for the trans youth, there's definitely different people kind of talking about their experiences, talking about their opinions. Like you have Jazz Jennings on Instagram, talking about her experience when she was younger, being told that she couldn't compete with girls and how that affected her. And then you see, Brandon Bowler, who's the father of a transgender daughter, talking about his experience in being a father in that case, and that was shared on Instagram and on Twitter. I mean, it's definitely a positive that he's able to get that message out. And then you have, Megan Rapinoe too, who her kind of opinion piece was very influential in this movement because it was kind of something that was spread very widely. And she's definitely an activist for a lot of different movements, and so it's not necessarily surprising to see her, kind of being in this. But it is interesting that you don't really necessarily have kind of trans women, or trans men for that matter, kind of leading this movement. So you can kind of see like there's definitely a certain amount of success for social media to be kind of informing people and really progressing this movement and getting support for this, but you don't really necessarily see it from the people who are experiencing this themselves. And that might be a facet of Twitter being generally for an older audience, and so you're not really going to see young trans youth on there. But it is an interesting thing when you compare to hashtag Let Her Run, which was mostly the intersex athletes themselves are kind of the face of that movement, and that movement has definitely been more representative of who's been publicly supporting it, because Caster Semenya herself has been kind of the face of it on social media and in traditional media. But overall, it's just not been as successful in kind of spreading kind of the message of the movement, because it's definitely the facts really can't even be set straight no matter the platform. So one of the reasons why I wanted to do this research in the first place was because I was curious why there was a lack of reporting in traditional media about Caster Semenya being intersex. So from what I was seeing, it was normally they would just say she was a woman with high testosterone, and that's true in some ways because he is a woman, but it's a bit misleading because there's more differences in her biology than just testosterone levels. So social media, for all its faults, for the movement, it's definitely been, in a way, more accurate in reporting because people who oppose the movement have been bringing up those differences. And I guess the overall message is that it definitely, social media definitely gives more space for dissenting views, I think, whether that's a good thing for a social justice movement or not. And depending on kind of what traditional media sources you're looking at or what echo chambers of social media you're in, you might not see those views, but they're definitely there in either platform. So I think really it's kind of hit or miss in how successful social media can be at facilitating these things, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And I'm also wondering, kind of going off of what you said, in the context of these movements, how do you think that idea that like all publicity is good publicity kind of fits in?
Yeah, so I think, for either of these movements, there's definitely going to be people who just aren't going to be convinced, and so you definitely do see some hateful comments that aren't grounded in, any evidence or reasoning. But beyond that, I think it all comes down to a case of, it depends. So for hashtag Let Kids Run, it really hasn't seen any bad publicity at this point because it's been so easy for people to get on board and support it. So every time an article or video from Brandon Bowler or Megan Rapinoe is shared, it just keeps getting spread in a positive light, and more people see it and become informed and part of the movement, or they just ignore it. But at least that's not a negative response. But for trans youth who are or aren't affected by these particular, bans, it's definitely a good thing to see, all the people who support them and that this is turning out to be a successful fight, whether the legislation is actually changed or not. Sometimes it's about, the thought was there, even if it's not successful. But I think it's definitely different for, hashtag Let Her Run and Cassius Menu, because she's been in the fight of her life, for so long, and as it stands, she still can't compete without lowering her testosterone levels. So I could see that as being, a good or bad thing for young intersex individuals to see, because they're definitely getting representation and seeing someone like them be strong, but to see her consistently beat down is a different thing. Our society, we don't really talk about the existence of intersex individuals, period, outside of, that like one episode, which is conspicuously present for every medical television show where there's a surprise intersex patient. But, I think any place where it's at least talked about is a good thing. But on the other hand, I can imagine it would be really hard to see those limits being placed on your body and not see a concerted effort to oppose that, like the trans youth can see. So social media definitely brings so much more into everyone's life by making everything so public and asking the question of whether or not seeing all of that all of the time is a bad thing for mental health and, queer and other at-risk youth is important, I think. And I'm not really sure if we have a consistent answer to that question yet.
Yeah. Oh, that totally makes sense. I think also something that we sort of found was kind of in common with both of our topics was this idea that I talked about also, which is like the policing of people's bodies. And so I'm wondering also what you think, to what extent are these cases an issue of policing the bodies of trans youth and intersex athletes?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think, I personally think this is a really interesting case because in some sense, with the history for these particular groups, it used to be, and in some cases it still is, that policing their bodies meant limiting their autonomy for medical transitions. And, doctors used to perform, quote unquote, like genital correcting surgeries for intersex youth at birth with or without the consent of their parents. And then on the opposite end of that, so instead of forcing a medical transition, there's cases where trans youth are prohibited from taking puberty blockers or beginning medical transitions, hormone transitions because they're underage. It's the opposite of not allowing them to have that autonomy to make those medical transitions. This is definitely a different case because it's not necessarily about telling them like, okay, I accept that you identify as trans or intersex and I'm telling you that you're wrong. It's definitely not that, because they're not saying, no, it's not valid that you're transgender or you're intersex. What they're saying is, okay, you identify that way, but we're not going to let you do this thing that everyone else can do, which is play sports with the gender you identify as, right? So it's definitely interesting because I think that this is totally a case of policing bodies. It's just happening in a different form, if that makes sense. So instead of saying that like, you don't have the control to do whatever medical transition you want to have or you don't want to have, like, we're going to let you do that because I would hope that, like, our society has progressed a little bit, past that to this point. But what they are saying still is because you have made this choice for yourself, or not for yourself, because, for people, that's how they're born. And really for transgender people, it's how they're born too. It's not, it really isn't a choice, but these people that are, trying to make these bans, in some cases, that's what they think, but it is a choice. And so they're saying, because you made this choice, we're not going to let you do something that everyone else can. And I would argue that it's successful in taking away an individual's autonomy over their body and their ability to feel like they're just like anyone else by, taking away their ability to do something in the same way as taking away their ability to have that autonomy for medical transition.
Right, yeah. I think also something that, I think the usage of social media is really interesting for both of our projects because I think, you're sort of talking about this idea of reaching out to others who are not in the group that is raising awareness of their issues, like people who are not trans youth or people who are not intersex, and how social media can or can't be effective for that. And I'm kind of talking about like raising awareness within a group, like trans YouTubers talking to trans youth and making content for them. And so I guess I'm wondering like how you think that using social media to like reach out to others who are not in the group has been effective or like maybe not so effective.
Yeah, I mean, I think activism is I think just less successful in general when you're trying to reach out to someone who doesn't understand. And I think social media isn't necessarily the culprit here. It's just kind of the nature of the type of activism. I think in your case with, trans individuals making YouTube videos to educate other trans people who are looking for that information because they're really not getting it from any other sources. And even just, the occasional cisgender person who, wants to know because they have a trans friend or a trans child or whatever it is that they want to see this information. The ability to have that there and to have, that mode for social change because that education is finally available when it's traditionally not gotten in schools or anything like that. I think it's definitely a benefit, but at least from my research, I think it is definitely a different case when you're trying to get the opinion of someone who isn't affected by whatever discrimination is happening to agree with you, because you're not always going to get them to agree, regardless of if they're just someone who's transphobic or just never going to see your side of it. Sometimes their interests just don't align with yours, and so there's not really as much wiggle room for you to do something about that. So I think just activism in general, when it's trying to educate people and just get support for people who are within your own group, it's definitely a lot easier to do that than to kind of go out there and change minds. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
That's very true. I think for my research, that it is not primarily for trans people who are seeking out support and guidance, but also for cis people who might be wanting to help their trans relatives or friends. And I think also just by virtue of kind of I tend to have a very broad definition of activism, by which I mean I think that educating people and teaching them this is what this identity means, or this is something that happened in queer history is activism. But I think also just I think that's a very kind of powerful way of resistance to be empowering people and telling them that they'll be okay and they're valid and worthy of respect and love and all these things. That's not necessarily teaching people concrete history or definitions or what we might see as activism in public spaces, but it's definitely kind of teaching people that their humanity should be respected. And I think that's also something that's probably been happening on YouTube. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Narrow Line of Acceptance. Be on the lookout for another episode where we'll do an in-depth look at Instagram beauty standards. Don't forget to comment, and subscribe. Bye!